The current dilemma of the ruling class in the United States. Dialectic by TheDashRendar on Reddit. Protests and demonstrations on a scale never before seen in the United States against police brutality and racism have erupted over the death of George Floyd. Only one of the 4 officers involved is actually facing any charges, and even then, that is most likely going to be a slap on the wrist. The protesters are now in control of entire areas of the cities, police forces are stretched to their capacity, and for the first time in American history, the American bourgeoisie are at the risk of losing control of the situation. This dialectic demonstrates the dilemma that they are in and why they have been largely paralyzed in responding to these protests, which are drawing incredible popular support from the working masses.
So, we must ask the question, what is happening, why, and what is to be done? First of all, why not simply arrest all 4 of the police officers involved and throw the book at them? It was explicitly a murder, and at the end of the day, it is only 4 cops, so who cares? Well, the problem here is that this would be an explicit betrayal of the police from the bourgeoisie. The police are the main domestic tool of the bourgeoisie, which they use for the protection of their property and repression of the masses. However, there is a level of trust requirement between the police and the bourgeoisie that runs both ways. It has long been established that white supremacists have not only infiltrated but overrun the majority of American police institutions. George Floyd is not an isolated incident. There are countless thousands of George Floyds in the United States who never had their murders captured on camera. Many thousands of officers are well aware of the crimes of Derek Chauvin because they partake in them themselves, or at the very least are unbothered by their occurrence. So, if the bourgeoisie were to hang 4 of their own police protectors for this crime of white supremacy, therein is the betrayal of the rest of the racist, fascist police force and the police system. If this police force feels betrayed, then they might not be inclined to continue to put their lives on the line in these grueling 15-hour protest days to protect the bourgeoisie. Some of them may even join the protesters. The bourgeoisie would no longer have their first line of defense in place, and all of their property, means of production, and positions of power will be vulnerable. So, no, the capitalist state is incapable of bringing justice for George Floyd. Indeed, they have already doubled down with utterly dubious evidence rushed from the coroner's office attempting to sell a narrative that well-respected and beloved community man George Floyd died not from 9 minutes of a knee to the neck, but from some imagined, yet-to-be-identified intoxicants. This crooked evidence threatens to undermine any sort of judicial process, and with the charges currently standing at manslaughter, it is unlikely that Chauvin will endure more than a couple years of actual jail time. No more racist cops is not an option for the bourgeoisie. Of course, one might beg the question, surely even the other cops, even the racist ones, can see the scale and scope of this and understand that 4 of their worst have got to face consequences for their actions. So, why are the police fighting so hard to protect Derek Chauvin? Well, the police cannot allow Derek Chauvin to face justice, because this sets off a world-ending precedent to them. In the exact same way that this is about more than just George Floyd for the protesters, this is about more than just Derek Chauvin and friends for the police. It was Fidel Castro who famously said, "A revolution is not a bed of roses. A revolution is a struggle, a fight to the death between the future and the past. The protesters are our future, and the police are our past. And for those who have not yet taken a stand, the hour is coming when you too will have to choose a side." But this unknown future presents a great danger. If justice can come for those 4 cops, then who is to say that justice, especially justice against crimes of white supremacy, may also come for them as well? What they have gotten away with in the past may be looked at again and reviewed. If this white supremacist crime is brought to justice, then other recent ones that were not may be as well. That is a haunting and terrifying realization for nearly all of the police. If these 4 guys have to answer for what they did, then there's nothing that will stop the same protesters from investigating and seeking justice for even more white supremacist crimes. It is a slippery slope to hell, and the police are on the edge because it is their life on the line too. That is why the cops are so crazed and absolute about this. They have been preparing for this. This is why they are all almost unanimously and collectively digging in their heels. In the same way that the protesters are George Floyd, all of the cops mobilizing in the streets are Derek Chauvin. But where the police fight on behalf of the oppressors, upholding injustice and racism to protect the cozy property and lives of the wealthy, Black Lives Matter is fighting for the oppressed, literally for the right to breathe. So, if that is not an option, then why not go to the opposite direction? Why not denounce the protests and the protesters, allowing the police to crack some skulls, not shooting at them, but making arrests at will? Well, As it stands, this is more or less what the bourgeoisie would like to do, and are attempting to do and have done in some areas. It would force the protesters back into their homes, allow the police to take control of the streets, and sufficiently suppress the protesters enough to attempt to resume normality. This was largely how they have handled major protests of this scale in the past. However, it is exactly here that the bourgeoisie have encountered a problem, one which the American bourgeoisie have never encountered or experienced before, and one for which they have no immediate solution. The scale of the protests is much larger than they ever could have imagined, and, more importantly, it is much larger than they can ever reasonably manage. Even though they have the capacity to arrest hundreds of thousands nationally, there are millions of people out in the streets. Not only do they lack the capacity to arrest all of us, the sheer quantity of people makes it difficult to even make arrests, as police are losing or have lost control of the situation in many areas. Police are also being met with resistance from transit unions and workers refusing to cooperate with the police and transport protesters to jails. But on top of this, despite attempts from media outlets to demonize the protests, they are being met with substantial support from the public and even some major public figures. Of course, leftist organizations immediately threw their weight behind the protesters, adding their voices to the struggle. The silence elsewhere speaks volumes. Politicians, white suburbanites, celebrities, business leaders and businessmen, and other organizations are all quietly making distractions for themselves. Perhaps a mild tweet condemning racism, but otherwise very little is said about the protests. Much like the bourgeoisie, many of them are clutching their pearls and secretly rooting against the protesters, but are drowned out by the overwhelming masses supporting Black Lives Matter and this overwhelming in scale protest. So, adopting a more hardline approach to the protests is not an option either. So, why not pull back and take a more hands-off approach? Tell the police to hold back, give the protesters more room and more space, and hope that the movement will eventually burn itself out. Well, the catch here is that this is not a benign protest. Unlike most, not all, protests of recent American memory, this is not a protest to which you parade around your enormous George W. Bush puppet, or bring the kids and grandma and turn it into a picnic. This is a very angry protest, and rightfully so, and with the amount of fully justified anger and rage, not just against the officers that killed George Floyd, not just the racist police system, but the entire establishment that they protect. And with that anger, combined with the sheer scale of the protests, comes the most sacrilegious and terrifying phrase to the bourgeoisie: property damage. The scale of property damage cannot be overstated. Not because the protesters are burning the city to the ground, quite the contrary, only a handful of buildings have been destroyed nationwide so far, but because this threatens to deal a critical blow to the control of the means of production within the United States. While we are a little over a week into the protests, they are showing no signs of dying out until justice is served. If the protesters are capable of overrunning a police precinct, literally the enforcer-repressor base of operations in the area, then they are also capable of overrunning an Amazon warehouse, a superstore, or even a factory or large business. Imagine the terror of the Walmart manager if the protesters come through those sliding glass doors, or if the employees too join in the revolt. Indeed, giving the protesters space could very well dissipate a movement whose concerns were wishes or conveniences or ideals. However, this is a movement whose concerns are grounded in material oppression, and, as the Marxists, Leninists, and Maoists correctly pointed out, revolutions begin not where capitalism is the most advanced, but where oppression is the greatest. And there is no greater oppression in America right now than in the knees of the police on the necks of our brothers and sisters. These protests will, hopefully and theoretically, not stop without justice. So, what about making concessions to the protesters? If the bourgeoisie cannot put the racist police behind jail, can they not at least offer concessions to the victims or protesters? Well, historically, this was one of the ways in which the United States has managed to memorialize protests of this magnitude in the past. The last time concessions of this nature were given was under Richard Nixon, which resulted in the several few remaining tattered threads of the American social safety net, which has long since let millions of Americans plummet to their deaths. In a deep irony, concessions would, at this point, be the least likely to succeed alternative to bringing the police to justice. But also, at this point, concessions would have to be so significant and enormous that it would forever change the lives of millions of people. $1,200 checks for everybody involved will not cut it by a long shot. If such an insubstantial, insulting offering of this nature were made, then it would only likely escalate the protests further. We are fortunate in this case that no clear leadership has emerged in the protests, as it makes the bourgeois trick of buying the leadership a non-option, as there is no one with the reins to co-opt this movement yet. This movement will eventually be exposed to this and will require a leadership body to orchestrate the masses in unison. Ideally, this leadership will be people of color, but also those versed in Marxist theory, to thwart any attempt to co-opt, mislead, buy out, or diffuse this very charged, very radical movement. Indeed, many would-be co-opters are already falling by the wayside, such as right-leaning celebrities or opportunists calling for an end to the protests go ignored by the much wiser masses. The beautiful tragedy, of course, is that the horrified bourgeoisie, led by the egomaniacal Donald Trump, are all but incapable of making the necessary concessions for peace. Trump's ego is too far gone to even possibly consider taking a massive L to these protesters, and the bourgeoisie, if they even have the liquidity, are far too unwilling to eat the costs of programs that might deprive the miserable existence of the poor. Another question to be asked is, what about Donald Trump? If he is the chief administrator for the bourgeoisie, then what is his role in all of this? What about his supporters, and why is he weirdly denouncing anti-fascist action and making strange remarks rather than going after the protesters? Well, strangely, the Trump supporter worldview may be more grounded in reality than the liberal worldview at this point, although the Trump supporter worldview is merely a twisted, inverted mirror image of the actually existing Marxist reality. They are aware of the threat to their comfortable existence, their investments, their cherished businesses, their passive income, and their vast tracts of property. They are all threatened by this current movement. Their understandings and explanations are, of course, filled with ideological and conspiratorial nonsense to fill the explanatory gaps. For example, the protests are far too popular to denounce, so Trump instead directs hostilities at an imagined Antifa leadership that does not exist. However, the Trump supporter base are well and fully aware that America is and was a nation built on slavery, racism, exploitation, and genocide. It is just that they celebrate this fact rather than experiencing the revulsion that any human with a shred of decency should feel. Indeed, they do understand their precarious situation, and we can take heart in the fact that they are losing control. If there were a modern incarnation of Tsar Nicholas II and Alexander Kerensky, it would be Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Tsar Nicholas was the man who consistently made every possible incorrect decision to exacerbate revolution, much like Trump, and we should find comfort in this. His ego is far too large to stand down, and his ignorance too great to possibly realize the consequences of his bad decisions, and his confidence blinding him to the exposed decay and rot at the core of the very idea that is American exceptionalism. America may never recover from this. That does not mean that it is a death blow, far from it, but the bourgeoisie may suffer lasting, meaningful damage to the American empire. The first ideological salvo has been fired and scored a direct hit, and it's being shot by those who have suffered the most and longest at the hands of the American empire. In case liberalism has left you numb to the world, that feeling in your temples and cheeks and neck and shoulders and your spine, the feeling you see when you watch a burning police precinct or workers taking back control of the empires they built, that's what justice feels like. The bourgeoisie cannot stand the taste, but the starved workers, they hunger for more. Another question is to be asked, what of the fascists? What of the white supremacists and Klansmen? They are watching this too, so what role do they play in this conflict? Well, white Americans, overwhelmingly, even the many of the oh-so-progressive, oh-so-polite, oh-so-sweet Americans with well wishes and kind words, their entrepreneurial spirit and can-do attitude, who overtly and enthusiastically have supported Biden or other Democrats at this point, they will likely find themselves not merely voting for, but feverishly yearning for Donald Trump to come this November. Contrary to the liberal worldview, we are not merely in a state of misalignment or misunderstanding. Rather, we understand each other perfectly and exist in a state of conflict against one another. The middle ground between us collapses like an engulfed McDonald's. Indeed, many of these reactionaries have been raised on a diet of fascist video games that have already indoctrinated them to defend Burgertown. It is here, I say, with the deepest concern for my comrades, I do not wish to scare or cause panic, but we as Marxists understand our fascist enemies all too well. For the brave protesters and resistors and revolutionaries with the courage to take this historic stand, this is a warning that must be heeded. The fascists are already planning backlash. This will come, and it will be merciless, it will be cruel, and it will be targeted specifically at us. There will be no police protection for us, and every instrument, tool, and apparatus available to the bourgeoisie that could be used to find us, isolate us, and kill us will be used. We will all die alone unless we stand together against their retribution for our defiance. During the coming months, the priorities of the revolution must be the following. 1. The revolution must establish a clear leadership body with specific goals and objectives. This movement must be led by people of color from the oppressed segments of society, but ideally also those versed in Marxist theory. White Marxists should know full well that our role is to support and defend this movement, not to arrogantly take command. 2. The revolution must begin to construct an alternative form of community self-defense. Never again should we depend on the police, but upon each other for protection. This cannot be a disorganized blob of well-wishers and good intentions, but an organized body, something that looks and operates like a police force, but with no police, and in service to the proletariat, the workers and the masses, rather than the bourgeoisie. If there is a chance to replace a bourgeois institution with one controlled by the workers, the protesters, then it must be done. Each new institution grows the power of the worker and reduces the power of the bourgeoisie. Now, of course, we must ask the question, how do we know this is a revolution? All the other protests in recent memory have fizzled out, so why won't this one? How come this one is the beginnings of a revolution? And what's different this time? Well, right now, we live in two separate realities, and they are on a collision course. The first reality is a reality in which America is a kind and good place, a few jagged edges and flaws, but overall a good place and good to most of its people. This is the reality that has spent the COVID epidemic watching Netflix, drinking expensive wine, and demanding businesses reopen so that the proles that serve them can resume their servitude. In this reality, Joe Biden is a perfectly viable political candidate to defeat Trump, and his victory will return America to this place of goodness. To them, Trump was the cause of these societal ills, when in reality, he is merely a symptom. These people are oblivious, deliberately or otherwise, to the other reality. In this reality, Joe Biden may as well be the corpse from Weekend at Bernie's in their backyard pool party. These privileged people simply wonder why the protesters do not return to their homes and allow this movement to die out. They have no conception of the struggles the poor masses in America face, no conception of how they have been marginalized for decades over and over, the ground beneath them taken away until there is nowhere left to stand. And still, more footing is taken away from them as they are forced to watch one another fall off the edge, forced to claw at one another for bourgeois table scraps. In this bleak reality, America is and always has been a racist, genocidal slaver nation, one that has continued this trend for 250 years with little interruption. It must be asked, to what home do these poor masses have to return to? Do they return to the $1,200 check that has not arrived yet and probably never will? Do they return to their abusive $6 an hour job that they lost 2 months ago? Do they watch a family member die of a painful death from an out-of-control disease that could have easily been prevented? Do they return to the coming evictions at the start of this month or next? Do they return to the unpaid credit card debt, compounding in interest beyond any impoverished person's ability to pay? All of these and more are boiling over right now, and for many of them, there is simply nowhere for them to retreat to. It should also be asked, why am I not seeing this everywhere in the media? If this is happening everywhere in the United States, which it is, the media is only focusing on small distractions, treating it like any other small protest. If this really is a revolution, why don't I know about it? Is this really that big of a deal? Now, firstly, for those who do not yet appreciate the level of media deception, and who have not already, I strongly invite you to turn on a live stream. Just Google protest live stream, and you'll get a real sense of the size. I suspect this is not what is being depicted to you on your TV news, or certainly not to the accurate scale. There is a stark contrast between the vast array of live streams from dozens of different cities with thousands of people in the streets in each city versus the nightly news treating this protest as if it were a single isolate event. If this were a hurricane or Black Friday, the media would be providing 24-hour live coverage, but they can scarcely spare more than 10 minutes of their broadcast hour for the protests. For the few non-Marxists watching this, something to be made clear is that the media is owned and controlled by the same corporations, the same people belonging to the rich people only club known as the bourgeoisie. They are the same ones who own and control the media. These are the same people who decide what content is shown and not shown, and how that content is presented to the public. They have no interest in sharing with you a situation in which they do not yet have control. They will never share or fairly present information that threatens their position. These are the same people whom the police are protecting. These are the same people who are fine with the knees of the police on your neck. Ironically, this is where Trump's rivalry with the media, focusing not on his policy but on his presentation, has led to a beyond partial distrust of the media from the public. Fake news, he correctly but inaccurately decried at the Gormless shills, as the public played spot the fake news along with him until no member of the public, save the neoliberals, could possibly trust or believe the information being presented by the news. Trump's vanity and sloppy arrogance is now backfiring against the bourgeoisie, as their most potent tool of control is left firing blanks. The most trusted names in news are now blitzed lanky stoners with Wi-Fi. Like me. So, to recap, the police can't back off, they can't do enough to suppress the protests, and they won't bring the cops to justice. So, what happens if the police or the military do as Trump suggested in his tweet and start shooting? This has likely been under consideration from the very first night, and increasing in probability with each night that follows. The protesters absolutely will be forced to retreat, at least temporarily, if the bullets fly. However, there is no certain outcome for this extremely dangerous and terrible course of action for the police, as it comes with the enormous risks involved. Indeed, perhaps the first real risk that many of these self-avowed bourgeois risk-takers have ever actually had to take. Even in a best-worst-case scenario, which would suggest a tiny massacre, where the police merely pop a few volleys down a handful of protesters and the crowds are repressed, we can only take guesses as to what would follow, but America would never be the same place again. Indeed, many people in the streets, as well as the infinitely many victims of American imperialism around the globe, they are already far too aware that America is a nation built on slavery, genocide, and capitalist oppression. However, for the sizable middle class in America, the cushion that insulates the bourgeoisie from the poor, the same class that spent lockdown watching Netflix and so on, America Tiananmen Squaring the protesters would shatter the United States of their imaginations forever. Many of the aforementioned people, still at home, still silent on the protests, are those who still envision America as the people in the movies that Tom Cruise works for when he saves the world from the dastardly Russians using F-14 Tomcats and motorcycles. To demonstrate to these people that they too live under the tyranny they only imagine in foreign countries is to add fuel to the even larger and more catastrophic risk being taken by the bourgeoisie. The larger risk that they are all too frighteningly aware of if they escalate the violence, they might lose. Not only the police being overrun by angry protest mobs, but the protesters responding with guns of their own. What began as a protest could very quickly turn into global condemnations of the United States, and even more violent responses from the protesters. The sheer number of people will be too much for the police to handle. Bringing in the military would be the result of a de facto civil war. Again, one which the bourgeoisie have no guarantee of victory. But, again, it can be asked, what is the most powerful institution in the world going to do in a worst-case scenario? Will the American army attack the protesters? Will an American soldier really be willing to kill American people? There is an interesting parallel here with regard to the military and the very real possibility that the state will use violence to suppress the protesters. This is one strange historical occurrence for Marxist revolutionaries that has yet to have had its historical follow-up, that of the Russian Revolution. In all other Marxist revolutions, the military sides with the state and the capitalists, and the Marxists were forced to combat both and overcome the military or be destroyed. During the Russian Revolution, there was a period in which Kerensky, the relative centrist between Lenin's Bolsheviks and reactionary czarists, presided over a dysfunctional, collapsing Russian government. In very much the same way, the United States Army might become dangerously radicalized like the Russian army did during the July days, where it split into the Bolsheviks and fascists, with the center, Kerensky, having no loyal units after the fact. We too can expect the modern-day incarnation of Kerensky, Joe Biden, to become a minor footnote in the history of the struggle. But as he has already demonstrated, he is incapable of leadership or relevancy. The fact that the bourgeoisie could lose control of an instrument of power as large as the military is quite a shock. There are plenty of fascists within, but white supremacy has not yet reached the same heights as the domestic police force. It's easy enough to convince a naive 18-year-old that America fights for freedom and foreigners hate them for their freedoms or other immaterial nonsense, but they will have a much harder time selling the same narrative about their own families and friends. A military disruption that destabilizes or even collapses some of the 800-plus overseas American bases will be amongst one of the greatest gifts Marxists worldwide could ever ask for. In liberating themselves, black Americans may also be a leading force in liberating the entire global proletariat.
from American capitalism. This is the current situation of capitalism in the United States of America. Thanks for listening.